The medical bay of the rescue cruiser was designed for emergencies. But the doctors had never treated anyone quite like Yuna Gilrath, stood outside the transparent barrier and watched them work on her husband. Their instruments moving with frantic precision as they catalogued injuries that should have been fatal. 3 broken ribs, a punctured lung, internal bleeding in multiple locations, a fractured collarbone, severe dehydration, and a concussion that had gone untreated for days. The human body was remarkably resilient, but even by their standards, Yuna's survival defied medical explanation. He had continued fighting with wounds that would have killed a Volanthi warrior, refusing to stop until every hostage was safe when the rescue team had found him. He had been conscious just long enough to confirm that all 300 civilians were accounted for before collapsing into the arms of the nearest soldier. That had been 12 hours ago, and he had not woken since Orith had commandeered the fastest transport available and rushed to the fleet. Ignoring every protocol and diplomatic courtesy that should have delayed her arrival, she was the high consort of the Third Ascending House, wife to a human hero, and she would not be kept from her husband's bedside. Now she waited, watching the monitors display vital signs that fluctuated between critical and stable with alarming irregularity. Myra Wan arrived shortly after, her face drawn with worry. "The doctors say he will live," Myra reported, "but recovery will take months." "He should have died," Iriath said, her voice hollow. "Yes," Mira agreed. "But Yuna has never been very good at doing what he should." They stood together in silence. 2 women from different species, united by their concern for one remarkable man. "I did not understand," Iriath finally said. "When they gave him to me, I thought he was ordinary, and I wondered why the humans would send someone so unremarkable for such an important alliance." Myra smiled sadly. "That was intentional," she said. "And after Korath, Yuna asked to be forgotten, to be allowed to fade into obscurity and live a quiet life. And we tried to give him that, by hiding him in a political marriage, by giving him a purpose that did not require violence," Myra corrected. "And we hoped that being your husband would be enough for him, that he could find peace in building something instead of destroying it." Iriath turned to face the human woman. "But you knew you would not stay peaceful if someone needed help." "We knew," Myra confirmed. "And we hoped it would never come to that. But when those children were taken, there was no force in the galaxy that could have stopped him from going." The monitors beeped steadily, marking each heartbeat with mechanical precision. "Why?" Iriath asked, the question she had been carrying since the beginning. "Why does he sacrifice himself like this? And what drives him to break his own body for strangers?" Myra considered the question for a long moment before answering. "After Korath, someone asked him that same question," she said. "And do you know what he said?" Iriath waited. "He said that he was not special, not stronger or smarter or braver than anyone else. And he said that the only thing that separated him from other people was that he could not look away." "Look away from what?" "From suffering," Myra replied. "And when Yuna sees someone in pain, someone who needs help, he cannot pretend it is not his problem. He cannot convince himself that someone else will handle it. And he cannot accept that the situation is hopeless." She paused, her eyes glistening. "He once told me that if he let one person suffer when he could have helped, it would break something inside him that he could never repair." Iriath felt tears forming in her own eyes, an embarrassing display of emotion that she would never have allowed herself before, but she was past caring about appearances now. 2 days later, Yuna finally woke. Iriath was at his bedside when his eyes opened, confused and disoriented as he tried to remember where he was. "The hostages," he croaked, his voice rough from disuse. "All safe," she assured him. "Every single one." He relaxed back against the bed, relief flooding his battered features. "Good," he whispered. "That is good." She took his hand. The first time she had touched him voluntarily since their wedding ceremony. "You almost died," she said. "I have heard that before. You cannot keep doing this," she continued, her voice trembling. "You cannot keep sacrificing yourself for strangers and expecting to survive." He looked at her with those calm eyes, the same eyes that had faced 60 armed soldiers without flinching. "They were not strangers," he said quietly. "They were people who needed help, and that makes them worth protecting." "And what about me?" she asked, the words escaping before she could stop them. "Am I worth protecting too?" His expression softened, and she saw something vulnerable beneath the warrior's composure. "More than you know," he replied. The recovery took 3 months, during which the political landscape shifted dramatically. The purist vanguard collapsed as a movement, their surviving members surrendering to authorities rather than face the wrath of a public that had turned against them. Hardliners on both sides found their influence evaporating as the story of Yuna's rescue spread. A single human who had bled to save peace, who had destroyed an army alone to protect innocent children. The propaganda narratives that had sustained hostility for years could not survive such an example, and in the quiet of their quarters on Haven's Reach, 2 people who had married as strangers began to know each other as something more. Ilriath learned that Yuna loved cooking because it allowed him to care for others without violence. She learned that he still had nightmares about Korath Station, dreams where he failed and everyone died. She learned that beneath his calm exterior lived a man who felt everything deeply and simply refused to let pain stop him from doing what was right. And Yuna learned that his strange Valanthi wife was not the cold political creature she had pretended to be. He learned that she had volunteered for this marriage because she wanted to matter, to contribute something meaningful to history. He learned that she had spent their entire marriage waiting for him to disappoint her, and that his actions at Telos 4 had shattered every expectation she held about humans on the night before their first anniversary. Ilriath entered their shared common room and found Yuna standing by the window, watching the stars as he often did. She walked to his side and took his hand, intertwining her fingers with his. "I want to start over," she said. He looked at her with quiet surprise. "We began as a treaty," she continued, "as a political arrangement designed to end the war. But I do not want that anymore. What do you want?" She met his eyes. This man who was both gentle and terrifying, who could destroy an army and then make breakfast for his wife. "I want to know you," she said. "The real you, not the legend or the ghost or the treaty husband. Just you." For the first time since she had known him, Yuna smiled without reservation, a genuine expression of joy that transformed his entire face. "I would like that very much," he said outside their window. The stars continued their eternal dance, indifferent to the small miracle occurring between 2 people who had found something worth protecting in each other. The war was over, and something new had begun. Commander Rethes had conquered the colony in less than 2 hours with minimal resistance, and he had expected the humans to cower until his demands were met. He had not expected this. The first night had brought strange occurrences that he dismissed as the paranoia of undisciplined soldiers. The second night had brought death. 2 of his best warriors had been found in a maintenance corridor with their necks broken, their weapons missing, and expressions of absolute terror frozen on their faces. No one had heard anything, no one had seen anything. It was as if the shadows themselves had reached out and taken. Themrithes doubled the patrols and ordered his soldiers to move in groups of 4. But the attacks continued. The agricultural domes became hunting grounds where his warriors vanished without warning. The irrigation systems malfunctioned in ways that flooded corridors and created choke points that his forces could not navigate safely. Power failures plunged entire sections into darkness that seemed deeper and more menacing than mere absence of light on the third night. Rethes received a report that made his blood freeze. 20 of his soldiers were dead, and he had not even confirmed contact with a single enemy combatant. This is impossible. He snarled at his remaining officers. We are 60 trained warriors, and you are telling me that we cannot find one saboteur? Sir, one of his lieutenants said carefully, the men are saying that it is not a saboteur. Then what is it? The lieutenant hesitated before answering. They are calling it a ghost, sir. And they are beginning to believe that we have awakened something that should have been left alone. Rethes struck the officer across the face and ordered him to stop spreading superstitious nonsense. But privately, he was beginning to wonder if his soldiers were right. The attack showed a pattern that spoke of supernatural patience and inhuman precision. The enemy seemed to know exactly where his forces would be and exactly when they would be vulnerable. Every trap his soldiers set remained untrigged, while their own positions became death traps. Had fought humans during the war and knew their capabilities. But this was something different. This was a predator that had turned his own conquest into a cage on the fourth night. The hostages began to change. They had been docile and terrified since the occupation began, doing exactly as they were told and causing no trouble. Now they moved with a strange confidence, their eyes carrying a spark that had not been there before. These realized too late that someone was communicating with them. Human resistance began as small acts of sabotage that his stretched forces could not prevent. Food supplies were contaminated in ways that made them unpalatable to Volanti. Physiology equipment was moved or damaged during the brief moments when guards were distracted. Children whispered to each other in a code that his translators could not break, and always, in the background, his soldiers continued to die. The darkness had become an enemy that his warriors could not fight. Maintenance quarters that had been secure yesterday became killing grounds today. Farming equipment that should have been harmless was repurposed into weapons that struck without warning. One squad reported encountering a maintenance drone that had been modified to spray industrial solvents, and 3 soldiers were permanently blinded before they could destroy it by the 5th day. Rethes controlled only the central command hub and the main hostage-holding area. The rest of the colony had become territory that his soldiers refused to enter. Morale had collapsed completely, with warriors who had volunteered for a glorious mission now begging to be allowed to surrender. And then the ghost revealed himself. Rethes was reviewing the shrinking map of his controlled territory when the main door to the Nan hub slid open and a single figure walked through. The human was not impressive by physical standards. Smaller than most of the warriors Rethes commanded, his clothing torn and stained with what might have been blood or soil or both. His face was bruised, one eye swollen nearly shut, and he moved with the careful gait of someone carrying injuries that should have been disabling. But his eyes were steady and cold as he surveyed the room, and the 12 soldiers guarding the command hub suddenly felt very small. My name is Yuna Seong, the human said, his voice calm despite his obvious injuries. I'm here to offer you a choice. Rethes rose from his command chair and drew his sidearm, pointing it directly at the intruder's head. You are in no position to offer anything. He snarled. Your soldiers would disagree, Yuna replied without flinching. And the 27 who were still alive. I mean, not the 33 who made the mistake of underestimating me. Rethes felt his grip on the weapon. Waver 33 dead, more than half his force eliminated by 1 human in 5 days. You can surrender now and face Volanti justice. Yuna continued, or you can fight and face me. But I should warn you that I'm very tired and very angry, and when I get this way, I tend to be less careful about keeping people alive. You are one wounded human, Rethes said, trying to project confidence he no longer felt. And we are 12 armed warriors. 13 counting you, Yuna corrected. But let me tell you what will happen if you choose to fight. He took a step forward, and somehow that small movement made several of the guards step back. Your soldiers will fire their weapons, Yuna said quietly. And they will miss because they are scared, and I have been dodging gunfire for 5 days. And while they are reloading, I will close the distance. Another step forward. The first 4 will die before they understand what is happening. He continued. And the next 4 will die trying to run. And the last 4 will die wondering why they ever thought this was a good idea. He stopped, his swollen eyes fixed on Rethi's. And then it will be just you and me, Commander, and I will make you watch while I free every single hostage. And then I will personally deliver you to whatever authority wants you most. The room was silent except for the harsh breathing of terrified soldiers, Yuna said, his voice softening slightly. You can put down your weapons now, and no one else has to die tonight. Rethi's looked at his soldiers and saw the truth written on their faces. They had stopped believing in victory. Days ago they had only remained, because leaving meant facing the ghost alone now. The ghost was offering them a way out, and they were desperate to take it. Do not listen to him, Rethi's ordered. He is just one human, but even as he spoke the words, he knew they were meaningless. The proof of what one human could do lay scattered throughout the colony. 33 warriors who would never see home again. One of the guards dropped his weapon, then another, then the rest, until only Rethi's remained armed in a room full of surrendering soldiers. Last chance. Yuna said Rethi's raised his weapon and fired. The shot went wide as Yuna moved with speed that seemed impossible for his battered body, crossing the distance between them in a heartbeat. The last thing Rethi saw was a fist coming toward his face. And then there was only darkness when the joint rescue fleet arrived hours later. They found the vanguard soldiers restrained and the hostages freed. And at the center of it all, they found Yuna Xiang, finally allowing himself to collapse now that his work was done. The command center of Haven's Reach had become a war room overnight, filled with diplomats and military officers from both species, shouting at each other while the clock continued. Its merciless Count Doniliath stood at the edge of the chaos, watching her father argue with the human ambassador about acceptable responses to the crisis. The purest vanguard had chosen their target well. A remote agricultural colony with minimal defenses and maximum symbolic value. 300 human civilians, including 47 children, were now prisoners of fanatics who believed that peace with humanity was the ultimate betrayal. Every proposed solution carried unacceptable risks. A military assault could trigger mass executions before the rescue force even landed. Negotiations had failed because the vanguard demanded something no government could give, and with each passing hour, the deadline drew closer. Eliath noticed that Yuna had been unusually quiet throughout the discussions, standing apart from the main group and studying the tactical displays with intense concentration. She approached him carefully, unsure of what to say. The children, he said before she could speak, his voice soft but carrying an edge she had never heard before. How old are they? The youngest is 4 years old, she replied. The oldest is 16. Something shifted in his expression, a hardening around the eyes that transformed his gentle features into something else entirely. I need to make some calls, he said, and excused himself without further explanation. She watched him leave the command center and felt a cold certainty settle in her stomach. 3 hours later, Sorenth found her in the observation lounge and delivered news that confirmed her fears. Your husband has requisitioned a small shuttle, he reported, and filed a flight plan toward the Telos system. Telos 4, she said, naming the colony where the hostages were held. Yes, he's going alone. Sorenth nodded grimly. The station commander tried to stop him, But apparently your husband carries authorization codes that override local command. And by the time anyone could escalate the issue, he was already gone. Iriath stood and walked to the viewport, staring out at the stars as if she could somehow see her husband's tiny shuttle racing toward impossible odds. "He will die," she said. "Perhaps," Sorrent agreed. "Or perhaps the purest vanguard will learn why the humans kept his identity hidden." She turned to face her aide. "You know something. I know only what our intelligence could piece together," Sorrent said carefully. "But I have been researching since you first asked about Cora Station. And what I found is remarkable." He activated a display panel and called up a series of documents and testimonials. "The siege lasted 47 standard days," he began. "And during that time, your husband did not simply defend the station. He turned it into a nightmare for our forces." The reports painted a picture that seemed impossible. Una had used the station's maintenance systems to create traps that ranged from simple pitfalls to elaborate ambush using industrial equipment. He had learned the patrol patterns of the Volanthi soldiers and exploited them mercilessly, appearing from nowhere to strike and then vanishing before anyone could respond. He had left messages for the civilian staff, hidden in places only humans would think to check, coordinating a quiet resistance that kept morale alive even as the situation grew desperate. Our commanders became convinced they were facing a full squad of elite soldiers, Sorrent continued, and they requested additional troops 3 times, each time receiving reinforcements that your husband proceeded to neutralize. How did he survive? He did not sleep for the final 19 days of the siege, Sorrent replied. And when the rescue fleet arrived, they found him standing guard over the civilian shelter with 17 broken bones, internal bleeding, and a fever that should have killed him 3 days earlier. Iriath felt her throat tighten. He refused to fall until he knew the civilians were safe, Sorrent finished quietly. And the medical reports indicate that he collapsed the moment the first rescue soldier entered the shelter. She understood now why the humans had sent him for the peace marriage, not because he was unimportant, but because he was too important to risk in further combat. They had given her their most precious warrior and disguised him as an ordinary man, hoping that peace would allow him to finally rest, and now he was flying toward another impossible situation. Because children were in danger, she contacted Mira Wan through the emergency communication system, demanding answers. "Why did you let him go?" she asked, her voice sharp with fear and frustration. "Let him?" Mira laughed bitterly. "No one lets Una Siang do anything. And when he decides to move, you either get out of his way or get run over. He will be killed." "Maybe," Mira agreed. "But those children will not be." "You sound certain of that." There was a long pause before Mira responded. "After Karth, the psychologists wanted to understand how he did it," she said, "and they ran every test imaginable, looking for some explanation for his capabilities. And do you know what they found?" Iriath waited. "Nothing special," Mira continued. "No genetic enhancements, no cybernetic augmentation, no exceptional physical attributes at all. And when they asked him how he survived, he just looked at them and said that giving up was not an option. That is not an explanation." "No," Myra agreed. "It is not, but it is the truth. And that is why we follow him, and that is why we love him. Because Una Siang simply refuses to accept that some things are impossible." The communication ended, and Iriath was left alone with her thoughts and her fear. She returned to the command center and demanded access to every sensor array and communication intercept that covered the telesystem. If her husband was going to die, she would at least bear witness. The hours that followed were Agon Una's shuttle went dark as it entered the colony's sensor range, disappearing into the void like a ghost returning to the shadows for a long time. There was nothing. Then the first reports began to arrive, intercepted Vanguard Communications spoke of missing sentries and unexplained equipment failures. The purest commander, a fanatical officer named Rethes, dismissed the initial concerns as technical issues and nervous soldiers, but the reports kept coming. 2 guards vanished from their posts without a trace. The power grid began failing and random sections movement was spotted in the agricultural domes that did not match any known patrol patterns. By the second night, the intercepted communications had changed in tone from annoyed to frightened. Soldiers were refusing to patrol alone, speaking of shadows that moved wrong and sounds that came from impossible directions. One transmission caught the moment a Vanguard soldier encountered something in the darkness and began screaming about the darkness having teeth. Before the feed cut to status, Ilyath listened to it all, her heart's pounding in her chest, and realized that she was hearing the sound of 60 trained soldiers, learning what one determined human could do. Her husband had begun his work, and the purest Vanguard was learning to be afraid. 3 months had passed since the wedding, and Ilyath still did not understand her husband. They had settled into a routine on Haven's Reach, a neutral diplomatic station that served as their official residence, and Yuna had proven to be the most considerate roommate she could have imagined. Learned her dietary requirements within the wedding first week and began preparing meals that accommodated her Volanti physiology. Asked questions about her culture with genuine curiosity, never prying into sensitive areas, always respecting boundaries. She had not even needed to establish he was kind and attentive, and utterly frustrating because she could not find a single thing to resent about him. This was not how political marriages were supposed to work. She had expected cold indifference or perhaps awkward attempts at forced intimacy, something she could endure with the dignified suffering her position demanded. Instead, she found herself sharing breakfast with a man who remembered exactly how she preferred her morning tea and who always asked about her day with what seemed like honest interest, visited regularly to provide intelligence, updates, and maintain her connection to Volanti politics. And he shared her confusion about the situation. He's either the most skilled manipulator I have ever encountered, Soren said during one of their private meetings, or he is exactly what he appears to be. And what does he appear to be? Ilyath asked Gedzeranth, considered the question carefully before answering. A good man, he finally said, which should not be possible for a human. Ilyath had grown up on stories of human brutality, tales of their endless wars and their capacity for violence that exceeded anything in Volanti history. The propaganda had painted them as barely civilized predators who had clawed their way to the stars through sheer aggression. Yuna Xiang did not fit that image at all. She began researching his background through official channels, trying to understand who she had actually married. His service record was remarkably thin, containing only basic information about his rank and assignments, with large sections marked as classified beyond her access level. The redactions bothered her more than anything else. Why would an unimportant man have so many secrets? Her opportunity to learn more arrived unexpectedly when a human visitor came to the station. Lieutenant Mirahan was a compact woman with sharp eyes and a warm smile, and she greeted Yuna with the easy familiarity of an old friend. "You look good," Mira said, embracing him in the human fashion. "Married life must agree with you. It has its benefits," Yuna replied. And Ilyath noticed that his smile seemed more genuine than usual. She observed them from across the common room, pretending to review diplomatic correspondence, while actually straining to hear their conversation. Most of it was mundane catching up, stories about mutual acquaintances and updates about people she did not know. Then Mira mentioned something that made her pulse quicken. "The memorial service for Chorus Station is next month," Myra said, her voice dropping lower. "Will you attend?" Yuna's expression did not change, but something in his posture shifted almost imperceptibly. "I have not decided," he said. "The survivors would want to see you," Mira pressed. "You know they would. The survivors need to move forward with their lives," Yuna replied quietly. "Not dwell on the past." Myra looked like she wanted to argue but chose not to continue the discussion. Ilyath filed the name away for later. Research car station after Mira departed. Ilyath approached her husband with careful casualness. "Your friend seems nice," she said. "Myra is one of the best people I know." Yuna agreed. She mentioned something about a memorial service. Ilyath continued, watching his face for any reaction. For car station, the flicker in his eyes was so brief that she almost missed it. A shadow of something deep and painful that vanished almost before it appeared. "A supply depot that was attacked during the war," he said. His voice perfectly even. "Many people died. You were there?" "I was assigned there briefly," he confirmed, and offered nothing more. She recognized the deflection for what it was and did not push further that night. After Yuna had retired to his chambers, she contacted Sorenth with an urgent request. "I need everything you can find about a human installation called Korath Station," she said. Sorenth returned the next day with troubling news. The station was besieged by Volanti forces for 47 days, he reported, and the details are difficult to confirm. "But our intelligence suggests something remarkable occurred there." "What do you mean?" "The garrison was small, barely enough to maintain basic operations. And when our forces arrived, they expected quick surrender. But someone held them off." Ilyath felt her skin tighten with anticipation. "Who?" "We do not know for certain," Sorenth admitted. "But our soldiers who survived the siege spoke of a single human who turned the station into a death trap. A ghost who appeared from nowhere, killed without warning, and vanished before anyone could respond. One human against a siege force? Over 200 of our warriors died before reinforcements arrived to rescue the station," Soren said grimly. "And when they found the defender, he was standing alone among the bodies, having protected the civilian staff the entire time." Ilyath sat in stunned silence as the pieces began to fall into place. The redacted service record, the reverent looks from the soldiers at her wedding, Myra's careful words about survivors wanting to see him. "The humans call him something," Sorenth added quietly. "A title that our translators struggled to convey properly." "What do they call him?" "The Ghost of Korath," Sorenth replied. "And they speak the name like a prayer." She returned to her quarters that evening and found Yuna reading by the window. His posture relaxed and his expression peaceful. This quiet, gentle man who made her breakfast and asked about her day. This same man who had killed over 200 Volanti soldiers alone. She did not know what to say to him, so she said nothing at all, but she looked at him differently now, seeing not the unremarkable husband she had been given, but the extraordinary warrior he had chosen to hide. The peace between their species suddenly seemed fragile in ways she had not considered before. If men like Yuna Xiang existed among the humans, what else had her people failed to understand about them? The answer came 3 days later when Sorenth arrived with news that made her blood run cold. A Volanti splinter faction called the Purist Vanguard had attacked a human agricultural colony and taken 300 hostages, including dozens of children. They demanded that the peace treaty be nullified, or they would begin executions. "Both governments are paralyzed," Sorenth reported, "and the deadline is 72 hours away." Ilyath turned to find Yuna standing in the doorway, his face expressionless as he absorbed the information for the first time since she had known him. She saw something dangerous in his eyes, something that made her remember what he truly was. Ilyath Vishen stood before the mirror in her ceremonial chambers and wondered if this was how prisoners felt before execution. The gown she wore was beautiful beyond measure, woven from silver threads that caught the light of the orbital station's artificial sun. But she could not appreciate it. Today, she would marry a human. She had never seen one in person before this week, only studied them through intelligence, reports and war footage that painted them as stubborn creatures who refused to accept defeat, even when logic demanded surrender. The war between the Volanthi Empire and the Terran Coalition had raged for 11 years across dozens of star systems, and neither side could claim victory. Her father, Archon Thelius Vetian, had finally accepted that the conflict would destroy both civilizations if it continued. A political marriage had been proposed by the human diplomats, a symbolic union between their species to cement the peace. Accord Ciliath had volunteered not out of love for humanity or belief in the cause, but because she was the third daughter of a minor ascending house, and her sacrifice would elevate her family's standing for generations. She had expected them to send a warrior, some scarred veteran whose presence would at least command respect. Instead, they sent Yuna Xiang. Had met him yesterday during the formal introduction ceremony, and he had confused her completely. He was not tall by human standards, his build lean rather than imposing, his face carrying a gentle quality that seemed wrong for a species known for its ferocity in battle. He had bowed to her in the Volanthi fashion, spoken softly, and thanked her for her willingness to pursue peace. There was all no demands, no posturing, no attempts to establish dominance, just quiet politeness from a man who seemed almost forgettable. Her aide Sarinth entered the chamber and knelt beside her. "High Consort, the ceremony will begin shortly," he said, using her new title with obvious discomfort. "Tell me honestly, Sarinth," Iriath said without turning from the mirror, "do you believe I am making a mistake?" The young Volanthi hesitated before answering. "I believe you are making a sacrifice that few would have the courage to make, my lady, and I believe the Empire will remember your name because of it." It was not the answer she wanted, but it was the answer she needed. She straightened her spine and prepared to meet her fate. The ceremony took place in the grand atrium of Orbital Station Serenith, a neutral facility constructed specifically for the peace accords. Hundreds of dignitaries from both species filled the observation galleries, their murmurs creating a constant hum that reminded Iriath of insects. She walked the ceremonial path alone, as Volanthi tradition demanded, her silver gown trailing behind her like a river of moonlight. At the altar stood Ambassador Kale Doran, the human diplomat who had arranged everything, and beside him waited Yuna Xiang. Her future husband wore a simple black uniform with no medals or decorations, nothing to indicate rank or achievement. He watched her approach with an expression she could not read, his dark eyes calm and patient. When she reached the altar, he extended his hand to help her up the final step. She did not need the assistance, but she accepted it anyway, because refusing would have been an insult. His grip was firm but gentle, and he released her the moment she was steady. The ceremony itself blended human and Volanthi traditions in ways that satisfied neither culture completely. They exchanged binding words in both languages, pressed their palms together in the human fashion, and allowed a Volanthi priest to mark their union with sacred oils. Throughout it all, Yuna remained composed and respectful, never rushing, never showing impatience when the final blessing was pronounced. The gathered crowd erupted in carefully measured applause. Iliath had become the first Volanthi in history to marry a human, and she felt nothing but hollow exhaustion. The reception afterward was a blur of faces and congratulations. That meant nothing. Gileath stood beside her new husband and accepted the well wishes of diplomats and military officers from both sides, all of them wearing smiles that did not reach their eyes. She noticed that the human soldiers treated Yuna differently than the diplomats did. The diplomats spoke to him casually, sometimes dismissively, as though he were merely a convenient tool for their political arrangements. But the soldiers, the Soldiers watched him with something that looked almost like reverence. A young human lieutenant approached to pay his respects. And when Yuna greeted him by name, the man's eyes glistened with barely contained emotion. "It is an honor, sir," the lieutenant said, his voice thick with feeling. "A true honor." Yuna placed a hand on the young man's shoulder and spoke too quietly for Ilriath to hear, and the lieutenant nodded before withdrawing. "You know him?" Ilriath asked when they were alone again. "We served together briefly," Yuna replied, and offered nothing more. She wanted to press for details, but a Volanthi admiral chose that moment to demand her attention, and the opportunity passed later that evening. They retired to the quarters that had been prepared for them. The rooms were spacious and elegantly furnished, designed to accommodate both species' needs. But they felt cold and impersonal. Yuna stood by the window, gazing out at the stars, while Ilriath sat on the edge of the sleeping platform and tried to process everything that had happened. "I want you to know," he said, without turning around, "that I have no expectations of you beyond what the treaty requires." Ilriath blinked in surprise. "What do you mean?" "This marriage was political necessity," he continued, his voice calm and measured, "and I understand that you did not choose me willingly. So I will not pretend that we are something we are not. And I will not ask you to pretend either." She did not know how to respond to such directness among the Volanthi. Political marriages often involved elaborate pretenses that both parties maintained for decades, never acknowledging the truth that everyone already knew. "You are very strange," she finally said. He turned from the window and smiled, a small expression that softened his features. "I have been told that before. Is that why they chose you?" she asked, genuinely curious now. "Because you are strange enough to marry an alien?" "Perhaps," he said, and there was something in his eyes that suggested hidden depths she could not fathom. "Or perhaps they chose me because I was available and unimportant." She studied him carefully, trying to reconcile his humble words with the way those soldiers had looked at him. "I do not think that is true," she said. He did not argue, but he did not confirm her suspicion either. "We should rest," he said, nodding toward the separate sleeping chambers that had been prepared for them. "Tomorrow will bring new challenges, and we will need our strength." She rose and moved toward her chamber, then paused at the door. "Yuna Siang," she said, testing his name in her mouth. For the first time, he looked at her with those calm, unreadable eyes. "Thank you for your honesty tonight," she said. "I did not expect it." "Honesty seems like the least I can offer," he replied, "given what you have sacrificed." She entered her chamber and closed the door behind her. More confused than ever, she had prepared herself to marry a monster or a brute, someone she could resent and endure with cold dignity. Instead, she had married a puzzle, a quiet man with gentle manners and soldiers who watched him like he was something. Precious sleep did not come easily that night, and when it finally arrived, she dreamed of shadows moving through darkness and a single figure standing against impossible odds. She woke with the feeling that she had missed something important, something that everyone else already knew outside her window. The stars continued their eternal dance, indifferent to the small concerns of one Volanthi bride and her mysterious human husband.